Go ahead, Manny. Pass the microphone over if you don't mind. Right here.
Thank you, Bintu, and let me once again congratulate Ambassador for the wonderful work you did during the negotiation. Even though I would have expected to see Ambassador Kamal's name there, being a very wonderful pilot that saw us through the process. We are happy that the plane did not crash on the way. We were able to lead us to the final destination. What you've done is not for the present, it's also for the future. And it transcends whatever government is in power in any country. For democratic systems, where we change government from time to time, definitely those that are running with this concept, with this idea, it will transcend whatever they are doing at the moment, to other governments that will be taking over from them. But I want to ask, looking at the dynamic situation in the HLPF, did it cross your mind that, maybe we could have done this thing in a better way than we did it that time? Maybe looking at how the discussion is going now, did it ever cross your mind that, if we had considered this, maybe this would have been in a better form? Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Actually, these are pretty big questions, so let me come back to the panel, and then we'll go to the next group. So please do think of your questions. Let me go back.
Thanks to everybody for those questions. First of all, Mara, about the Secretary General's report. Personally, I think it's an excellent report. It keeps the level of ambition very high, and as regards the UN's contribution to implementation of the SDGs. And it's also frank. It also identifies that there is a lot of silo thinking continuing, especially in the operations abroad. And this, I know, is the result of consultations, very extensive consultations, which have been carried out with the agencies, with member states in recent months by the Deputy Secretary General and her team. So I think it's very good that we confront the weaknesses in the UN system at this still relatively early stage. As far as I'm concerned, the report it's a very necessary contribution. It shows the scale of what the UN has to do if we're to be serious about this transformation agenda. It will beg many questions about resources, staffing, perhaps political commitment here and there, but a lot of important positive recommendations are made, especially around the role of resident coordinators. And personally, I think it's an excellent report. All I can say is we will be encouraging the Secretary General and his and the entire Secretariat to get it implemented, but it won't be easy. And however, I think a good start was made. The point from our colleague from the Major Group on Children. I think it is perfectly true to say that there are things which were omitted or not properly taken into account in the open working group phase, because to be honest, a lot of the detail of the goals and targets was settled in the open working group phase, and it meant that we found it difficult in the subsequent wider intergovernmental phase to interfere with what had been agreed earlier on. I suppose that one of the problems in retrospect was that there was a deadline for the open working group phase. It had to complete its work by July the 15th, I think, in 2015. So what that meant was there was an enormous, 2014, there was an enormous amount of technical work required in relation to each goal and each target. We all struggled to, I was there myself, we struggled to complete that technical work on deadline, within the deadline, but it wasn't possible. And you remember that some of the targets had X's still left in them because it hadn't been possible to put in percentage marks. So it's not, I agree with you, there are deficiencies. It was a collective failing perhaps. We got it maybe 99% right, but not 100% right. I do think that the format which Felix mentioned earlier, the cross-region format, did help us to make faster progress than we might otherwise have made. It did accelerate the work of the Open Work Group, but on points of detail we didn't quite get there, and you're right. And the last point from Emmanuel, as you were making your comment, Emmanuel, I remember, and Jimena remembers also, one very notable omission, which was that we didn't really devote enough time, enough attention to the predicament of migrants and refugees. I think that, in retrospect, I did first put my hand up and say that we did have some material on migrants, but it wasn't really enough. And afterwards, I realised that migrants are in many ways a classic example of people who have been left behind. We have the major migration crisis in different parts of the world, which threatened to overwhelm development budgets. So in a sense, if I were able to go back to it now, I would have liked to have a migration goal or target, set of targets. In the event we have, as you know, references to migration in a number of targets, and that gives us a basis to go on with. But that's just one example of an omission which struck me forcefully, because I then had to be the co-facilitator of negotiations on the New York Declaration, and I realised that there was a big omission there. But there were plenty of others as well. Maybe the only point to make is that I don't want to say that the SDGs are a work in progress, that they're not. They have been agreed, signed off on. But it was always understood that as the years went by, we would in effect have to adjust them, or we would be mentally adding things. I don't think we would be subtracting anything, but we would be mentally adding to the framework that we have. It was always understood that the HLPFs in particular would give an opportunity to update us, to draw attention to new and emerging challenges. So in that sense, it's a framework which will be steadily intensified, and that will give some opportunity to pick up the things that we didn't get to in 2015.
I will be very quick. In terms of the UNDS report, I feel that the most important job right now is leadership on the ground, because how do you change a bad habit? Well, first you have to, if people on the ground don't even know it's a bad habit, not to collaborate or to be in silos or to compete for funding, like first there has to be a greater awareness that there can be a different way of collaborating within the UN. And so, how do you change behavior? Only through like constant change, discipline, leadership. So it'll be more about the application of changing cultures and behaviors, not only for the UN, but also for governments. To work together is kind of a new thing. We will be releasing a report, IPI will be releasing a report on the role of the private sector on the SDGs, and the comment about cherry picking is very, very important, because there's two things. Right now, the demand at the local level for SMEs is not being met. So many SMEs want to contribute to the 2030 agenda. They're knocking on the UN's door and there's no answer. So if we want, the SMEs provide most of the work worldwide. So we need to bring them together. How? That's really a very important question for resident coordinators. How to bring the private sector, but particularly the SMEs at the local level, to engage in the agenda.
I've got my own. So a couple of things. I think that it is true that the HLPF has the ability to deal with new and emerging issues, which in fact the last 10 years of the CSD, Commission on Sustainable Development, didn't have. And so as issues emerge, they can be matured, maybe around the heads of state meetings when they happen every 4 years. The other thing is that there were a number of issues that didn't get in. So a good example of it would also be the antibiotic resistance issue, where the WHO report came out towards the end of the open working group, and Sweden was advocating for it, but people were exhausted by adding new stuff. It did get into the 2030 agenda. the following, it is in the text that wraps around the SDGs. So it did get in there, and so there is an ability to recognise that that you could add things in the 2030 period under Ambassador Donoghue. On the, I've done a blog on the, as I'm sure May has seen, on the my viewpoint on the development system thing. One thing I'd say is I do feel with a new head of UNDP that new head should be able to be given time to come and make forward the suggestions on what they think. I don't think reorganising the res reps is the first stage. If it was me, I would go to the country level and I'd ask, what do you want the UN to do in coordination at the country level? And I talk to the country at the country level and feed that into this conversation so it will be informed from the ground up, and that would then perhaps inform a contribution which UNDP could do in a number of scenarios. So I think that would be important. I also think that I would personally like to see the DSG in a more strategic role and not one where you end up with too much underneath that person, otherwise it'll end up with a new department as then you're managing and you're not playing a strategic role. But I mean, I think there's a lot of good stuff in the report, and I think it was a very good start.
Thanks so much. So we're running out of time. I've got Sakiko and then the gentleman in front of her and then the woman back there. So right there, yep, please.
I'm Sakiko Fukuda, law professor at the New School here. First of all, I do want to recommend the book to all of you because it is highly readable, it's very engaging, I think accurate. And
other endorsements are also welcome.
Buy more than one.
Yes, so I'll give my endorsement there. I do use it in my own writing and teaching. I wonder about the promise of the ambition of the agenda and the monitoring system. And in a sense, the whole way in which the Open Working Group and the Agenda 2030 transitioned into the selection of indicators through the IAEG sort of shifted the political dynamics and shifted the process into something quite different. And in that sense, I wonder if the ambition carried in, and the ambitions and also the integrated nature of the monitoring carried in, because now we have an indicator framework, which has all kinds of problems, but quite apart from that, it actually promotes siloed monitoring, goal by goal or target by target, rather than this holistic, integrative evaluation of where we are in getting that transformative change, leaving no one behind, in part because it's precisely those transformative elements that have no indicators or that are simply not reported on.
Great, thanks so much. The gentleman right here in front of her.
I'm Jean-Pascal Valli-Pessel, one of the members of the GSDR 2019 author team. So I revealed my potential conflict of interest. The question I wanted to ask is precisely over the role of science. I'd like you to comment on the role of science, scientific evidence, scientific analysis in the process leading to the SDGs, but also how you see it in the process, in the follow-up process. Science, and more broadly, science in the UN system. Is there a way to improve the quality of the science policy interface in the UN? I'd like to hear your thoughts about that. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. There's a woman behind you with the scarf there, the green scarf.
Yes, thank you. I'm Martina Kühner. I work in the Secretariat, but I also did research on this, and this is kind of also my Bible. You see it a little bit. I on purpose didn't take off all my post-its, so they're a little bit embarrassing. But indeed, I thought it was very helpful and useful also for the parts
right? You put
that I have not been able to join myself personally during my research. So my first short question is, can you sign it for me? And the little longer question, but also I'll try to keep it short, is now that we're here this week and next for the HLPF, do you have, from your insights from the negotiations of the follow-up and review process, that was also part already of the SDG framework, although less than what we are doing right now. is there anything that didn't make it into the book but that might be still useful for us here at the HLPF in terms of monitoring and review? Ideas that could be innovative and bring us forward in this high-level political forum. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much. And I think there's a gentleman here, right here on the end. We'll take them all now, so we'll try to be quick though. So.
Okay, thank you. I'm Ian Corsley, joined the Open Working Group I led for World Animal Protection, and now I'm here with the Donkey Sanctuary, looking at the linkages between poverty and livelihoods and disaster relief and gender equality by improving the lot of working animals, typically donkeys and mules. And it just strikes me that one of the great achievements of the Open Working Group was this: it's for everybody to look at how we have a sustainable planet and future for humankind. I would obviously say that there has to be a sustainable future for everything else that lives on the planet if it's going to be truly achieved. I was just generally interested how the authors think that the member states and the wider civil society are responding to those wider linkages. I suppose more simply put, how much more work do I have to do?
Great, and then here's, right here, the gentleman.
Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Mohammed, formerly from the civil society. Just to check if the book correlates to the SDGs and also what happened with the COP21 Paris, 22 Marrakesh, and 23 Bonn, led by Fiji. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we have two more, and then I'm going to cut off. It's the woman back here with the, just here, yeah.
Hi, Allegra Lorenz from Leiva, New York. You mentioned the rise of populism and disenchantment in hindering SDGs. I was wondering if you could possibly say some specific events that you had in mind, which might be helpful to realize what we are going into with the HLPF right now. Thank you.
Then the woman in the glasses, and last one here. Just here, glasses. Yep.
I'm Sania from International Federation of Medical Students Association. My question is still 13 years for 2030, but how do you see universal goals post 2030?
Universal?
Possible universal goals post 2030.
Oh, after 2030?
Yeah.
Oh, goodness gracious. Okay, last one.
I can say it without the microphone.
Yeah. Well, I think you have to first.
Okay. Hello, my name is Beth. I'm a PhD student at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. Transformation is a word that's been used a lot, a transformative agenda. I would like to know how each of you define transformation.
Let me add my own, which is, given the environment now and the personalities that you mentioned then, the political environment and all of this, do you think we could have gotten the SDGs again at another point or now? Take them as you'd like. I don't know who wants to go first.
I'll go first. On could we get the SDGs now? No. And I think we were very lucky. Again, if you look at the history of the process, many of the negotiators stayed through Rio Plus 20 through to the SDGs. So there was a built narrative of people who committed part of their big chunk of their life to making the SDGs successful. I would argue that the HLPF wasn't what we needed, and in fact there were two suggestions on the table at Rio Plus 20, the HLPF and a council of the General Assembly built on the idea of the Human Rights Council, and government split on that conversation. In the end we ended up with a hybrid, which is the HLPF. We might want to relook at that issue in 2023 on whether perhaps we need a more robust system. On the indicator stuff, indicators have been a mess. They fell apart in the 1990s. There was an attempt to do what we're doing now in the 1990s around Agenda 21. It all fell apart, and so people didn't set up the systems to monitor stuff. The things weren't there, and it only really started on the back end of the MDGs, and then clearly with the leadership of Stefan in the division on statistics, I think it's opened up a whole lot of new ideas on indicators and data, and that's why you have the World Data Forum happening every 2 years, so that new ideas on citizens data, on kind of all the new stuff that's coming can mature and then can come in and hopefully make the indicators better, not perhaps in this review in 19, but by 2023 and the review of indicators in 2024, they will. Are the indicators siloed? Yes, mostly they are, because that's at the moment where we are with that process, but they can become more integrated as we move on. There's clearly a wish for that to happen, so I think that's a really important thing. On the science, the scientists, in my viewpoint, made the biggest impact in the run-up to Rio+20. Planet Under Pressure was a huge success. The idea of planetary boundaries, the Oxfam donut, all of that. They dropped the ball because they started to then create Future Earth after Rio+20, and many of the people who had played such a significant role in the science conversation in the run-up to Rio+20 were not in the corridors during the SDG process, which I think was a real problem. And we're in danger of doing silo science with IPBES, IPCC. We need an overall science body of which IPBES, IPCC, whether there's one on chemicals or one's on oceans, fit together, or we'll go down a silo approach. And my final comment on what's missing is there's a whole lot of process stuff that's conversation around the private sector and what you do, one of which is that we need to set a date for stock exchanges to make it a listing requirement for companies listed to produce their ESG reports, which would then have an impact on small and medium-sized businesses who would have to be reporting to the larger companies. That's a really important aspect of what needs to be done. Brazil did it in the run-up to Rio+20 in the Sao Paulo exchange. South Africa showed the leadership. Malaysia's done it. Thailand's done it. Hong Kong's done it. So a lot of the leadership again has come from developing countries in this. But to do that would actually change the dynamics, and that would then go to something that UNF is involved in, which is called the benchmarking, World Benchmarking Alliance, which is where companies start to get benchmarked under each of the SDGs, and that starts to really, I think, then create a peer group pressure in the context of moving those forward.
Great questions, and I am particularly heartened by the copy that has transformed your Bible. It's really sweet to see that. Thank you. You know, we've been going, with IPI, we've been going to different countries. And my question was, how do I explain the SDGs without them being a shopping list? So when we were in Greece, the first thing they said, the priority is goal 8. Okay, goal 8, employment, right? Youth employment. So you can't achieve goal 8 if you don't have goal 4, right? Education. Nor goal 9, innovation. Nor for SCP, goal 12. So we built the story around the particular context of the country instead of providing them a list. Because if you have 17 goals, it just becomes overwhelming. So it needs to be presented through more like a story/system approach. And that needs to guide the indicator. So I feel that there's a lot more needed in terms of awareness building, in terms of the statisticians working on this agenda. They need to be able to connect the dots as well. So there has to be more training and more awareness of how this agenda breaks with the past. On Paris, I was both, I kept going to Bonn and to Climate and also to the OWG, and so I was involved in both conversations. And the negotiators here, particularly large economies, did not want climate in the SDGs. Climate came very late, and only thanks to the pressure from civil society that said, we won't be credible. And I remember Kamau lifting the New York Times and saying, we won't be credible to the world if we don't have a headline on climate change. That's why the goal is so thin. It's the smallest of them all. But it's because there was this huge resistance of connecting these two processes that were happening simultaneously. So at that time, it was impossible to connect them. Well, it was not impossible, and thanks to Trinidad and Tobago, who also helped push that, we got it, but it was very difficult. And then the last one on the disenchantment. There's glimmers of hope everywhere. When we were in Greece and we spoke to refugees and to displaced people, the 2030 applies to everyone, to asylum seekers, to refugees, to to migrants, and that's very important to also press on governments that this agenda, if we're serious about it, it's about reaching the furthest behind first. So even though we don't have targets on refugees, we need to now use the 2030 agenda to press on shifting the dynamics that's happening on issues like on accompanying children that are more traumatized by how they're received now than by what they lived in their own societies. So certainly the timing could not have been better in having the 2030 agenda. I think that the main actors to achieve the 2030 agenda are not diplomats. It's certainly not me. It's the people on the ground. We're just there now to support and help them achieve it. Thank you.
Thank you, too. I'm broadly in the same area as my two colleagues in terms of answering those questions, which are very good and very challenging questions. In relation to the indicators, I mean, it is fairly clear that silo thinking persists there, despite the best will and best intentions of everyone involved. I'm not sure is it because it was necessary to get technical advice from individual UN agencies, for example, and they had to be approached in terms of the current structure. So the advice fed into a set of indicators which perhaps bears more evidence of silo thinking than it should, but it'll take a while to change that. I do know that during the negotiations, a particular concern was that the indicators would not be politicized. By that, in other words, that you would not have member states trying to bring their political priorities to bear in the framing of the indicators. So I don't want to be too specific, but you could imagine that certain countries might have been uneasy about indicators being developed on issues which they were just grudgingly taking on board. So, you know, if a particular member state was uneasy about human rights issues, then it would not have wanted to see a lot of indicators appearing in support of those targets. So the main concern was to ensure that the set of indicators remained neutral and comprehensive, but that might have been at the expense of bringing in a set which would actually find this integrated approach that I'm talking about. So there was probably a greater concern to keep the indicators pure of any political interference, but that's just my own sense. In relation to the role of science, a very important question, Jean-Pascal, and I remember there was the initial meeting of the GSDR contributors, and I thought it was a very important meeting because, to answer your questions, science undoubtedly played a big role in the preparatory stage for the SDGs. We had to have the best possible evidence base for the identification of targets, and although, as I said a moment ago, we didn't achieve a perfect outcome, nevertheless I think it is a reasonably credible set of targets. So going forward, the role of the GSDR I think will be vital. We have to demonstrate that evidence is the only basis which counts in terms of measuring performance. We cannot have sort of woolly political statements. We have to show what countries are actually doing or what they're capable of doing in response to the agenda. That means we have to have scientists and researchers demonstrating what is really possible in relation to health or food safety or whatever. One thing I wonder about is how we will achieve the kind of integrated perspective among scientists, and I know there's a very distinguished group of people who will contribute to the GSDR, and they have been chosen obviously because they command a number of different disciplines, but there is still a temptation perhaps for some people to say, well, I'm an agricultural scientist, or I'm a space expert, or people will have their own areas of expertise. So I'm just wondering offhand how we will create that integrated perspective which will be needed. Martina had a question about the was there something which didn't make it into the book in relation to the or of relevance to the monitoring process. I mean, I'd just like to make a more general point here. The follow-up and review process, as it is called in the agreement, that was itself the outcome of a delicate compromise. You had on the one hand one set of countries, mainly what we used to call Western countries, or let's say global North, who wanted a fairly rigorous and systematic monitoring and accountability procedure. Now, even those words, monitoring and accountability, they might come easily to a sort of a global northern perspective. They are resisted by many in the global south who resent the idea that they would somehow have to account for their performance or that they would be forced to monitor. So those words are anathema. We never had to go for a softer alternative, which was follow-up and review. That's just one example of how language has to be acceptable to 193 member states, and that was why we got the term follow-up and review. But it means in turn that some people will say there's too much emphasis on the voluntary nature of this this review process. We need to, I mean, Felix mentioned a moment ago that conceivably one might need to think of a more rigorous approach in future. So there will be a debate on that. If you like, we solved the debate for the purposes of the 2030 agenda by reaching a compromise between the rigorous approach and the more relaxed voluntary approach, if I can put it like that. We got that compromise, but it isn't necessarily the last word. And as the HLPF develops, there may be people who will say we need something a little bit more systematic, but I just throw that out for consideration. And on the issue about transformation from Beth, I mean, I don't want to, Beth, I don't want to give too kind of glib an answer. It's a very important one. What do we each mean by transformation? I suppose my first reaction is to say that I mean by that the kind of change which comes about from the multi-dimensional approach which we have all been talking about here. In other words, Jimena gave an example there where, you know, goal 4 would have to be combined with goal 9 or whatever. That the kind of change that you get from looking at a range of goals together is, I hope, going to be lasting and sustainable change. And that's what I mean by the word transformation, as distinct from short-term palliatives, which mightn't actually, which might collapse after a year or two. So transformation is something much more profound. I think that was the last point I was going to raise. Sonia asked a question about universal goals after 2030. I believe that we are now irreversibly on a course which would mean that we will always have a universal approach. I think that there's no going back. What could happen is that you might even find that coming up to 2030, there might be a view that let's already now bring in, we might anticipate 2030, but I'm only just speculating that you know the world might decide that maybe a slight relaunch is needed or re-emphasis of something rather by 2025, 26. You know, I'm only just speculating, but that was the sense of the negotiations, that we should allow for a possible decision to bring forward even more radical goals late in the current period. That we won't just wait until 2030 and then see how it looks. But you know, that's only speculation. I think what is certain is that there will be another successor set of goals thereafter, a universal set. I can't imagine that we would go back to regional or more siloed goals as we've had before.
Thank you so much. I think we're out of time, but just want to say I think the three of you have sealed your legacy in a way, and if there's nothing else you do in your lifetime, the fact that you were so deeply involved in this incredibly bold endeavor, I think, and outlined in this book, I think is really just was so wonderful. So thank you, and thank you for giving me the And also thank you to Ambassador Donoghue, who is on his way to leaving us, but thank you.